Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today I'm going to be going through my January wrap-up. Now January is kind of an interesting month because I did start a new job and so I was spending a lot of time adjusting to my new schedule and my new role in my new job, and because of that I felt like I didn't read as much as I had been, which makes sense. I just didn't have as much free time as I had been having, which is fine, but I felt like I was reading a lot slower. I did end up reading 5 books, technically 4 3/4, but we're counting that 3/4 book as a full book, even though I didn't finish it until a few days into February, but we're counting it as January because I read most of it in January. So the first book that I read in 2023 was Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. So this is kind of a celestial-based magic fantasy inspired by pre-Columbus Americas. And basically we're following several timelines. We're following the timeline of one of the high priests in this holy city that is preparing for the winter solstice, where there's going to be an once in hundreds and hundreds of years eclipse that is going to be kind of this big magical event. And then we're also following a ship captain who has been tasked with transporting very special cargo to this holy city, the cargo being a person who doesn't really talk and he's blind and very suspicious. He's kind of explained away as being harmless, but our ship captain knows that if anybody is kind of described as harmless, it usually means they're the exact opposite. And so we're following kind of this priest, the ship captain, and then our mysterious passenger on the ship throughout the entirety of this story. And we do have flashbacks to a couple of the characters' pasts as they were children and growing up. But we're basically following these characters as they kind of all come together and approach this winter solstice and what that's going to mean for each of them moving forward. I know that's very vague, but I'm keeping it that way because that's how the synopsis keeps it, and I feel like, you know, there is kind of a reason for that. So while I enjoyed this book while I was reading it, I do think I'm really disappointed that overall it was kind of forgettable. It was very, very slow paced. I did have kind of a hard time really falling into the story. I found it very interesting once I did get into it. I did particularly like our ship captain and our kind of mysterious stranger passenger. I found myself increasingly frustrated and bored while reading from the perspective of the priest. I felt like her characterization didn't fit how I felt she was supposed to be, I guess. Like, you know, she's like this leader of this big holy city, and she felt very naive and very easily tricked, and it just didn't make much sense to me, and she was very frustrating to read from. But the other two I did really enjoy. I did really like the world and kind of the world building, the setting, the magic system, and kind of the different religions that made up this whole entire world. It was very fascinating, but I did, again, find the plot very slow, and that made this book kind of forgettable for me. It did really pick up towards the end, and I found myself very intrigued, so I did pick up the second book. I have not read it yet, but I do have it and intend to read it, just because I am very curious where this book went, and I'm hoping that the second book continues to build off of how this last third ended up going, because I did find it very interesting. Much of this book did feel almost like a prequel to what the story is supposed to be, but I don't know. Overall I was entertained while I read it, but I did find it kind of forgettable and I did give it 3 stars. And then next was my nonfiction read of this month. I listened to the audiobook of The Five: The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. So this obviously focused on the story of Jack the Ripper, but it did not talk about Jack the Ripper really at all. This book followed the lives of the 5 women that were determined to be the 5 victims of the infamous Jack the Ripper. We spend very little time on their murders, and we spend the majority of our time on each women's lives, from their parents' kind of situation right before each of the women's births, and then all the way up from their birth to their deaths. And I really appreciated this book's sole focus was to humanize the victims of Jack the Ripper, and it was also meant to debunk the myth that Jack the Ripper's victims were all prostitutes, because they were not. 2 out of the 5 did work in the sex work industry at some point in their lives. None of them were actively working in the sex industry when they were murdered, and 3 of them were never working in the sex industry. We spent a lot of time discussing how the media, even back then, skewed perceptions and was focused more on like dramatic headlines and money making, but we focus a lot on like what these women's lives were really like, and how many of them actually started out in very comfortable, if not prosperous, lives, and through a variety of poor circumstances and events ended up in the Whitechapel district, the very, very poor, destitute district of London, where they were ultimately murdered. Because they ended up in that district, people just assumed that they were all prostitutes. And I just really appreciated this book for how it was focused on the victims and spent a lot of time humanizing each of the women's stories. And I think that if true crime is something that you're interested in, I think that this is a very important book to read because it is very victim focused. And then after that I read Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones. This comes out February 7th. I did receive it in ARC. I won it on Goodreads. So thank you so much to Goodreads and the publisher for hosting a giveaway that I ended up winning. This is the 2nd book in the Witchlake trilogy by Stephen Graham Jones, the first of which being My Heart is a Chainsaw, which is one of my favorite books I think it was 2020 that I read it, and it's just stayed one of my favorite books. So this is the sequel. This is 4 years after the events of Don't Fear the Reaper, and we're in the middle of this huge blizzard, and Jade is returning to Proof Rock, Idaho, and at the same time there is a serial killer that is being transported to a different location and ends up escaping from his transport caravan, ends up in Proof Rock, and this book takes place over the course of 36 hours, and I think it's 20 deaths later it ends up ending. And so we're following Jade as she's returning to Proof Rock and finds herself immediately wound back up in a slasher, trying to find and take down this serial killer that is wreaking havoc in the middle of this insane blizzard. While I had a lot of fun with this and I really enjoyed it, I did not enjoy it as much as My Heart is a Chainsaw for kind of a variety of reasons. Two main ones. The first one is because in this book we don't follow solely from Jade's perspective like we do in My Heart is a Chainsaw. We actually follow from a wide variety of characters, both old ones from the first book and new ones. And we're also following, it's almost like a second generation of teenagers and potential final girls that this slasher is happening to, and Jade is kind of on the outside of it looking in. And because of that, and us not solely following from her perspective, it loses that punch in the gut sense that the unique voice of Jade had in the first book. There's also kind of a sense of chaos when it comes down to the different layers of what's happening in this story. There's like several things that are all happening kind of at the same time that all get entangled within this slasher story, but I think it's chaotic in a disorganized way that I think kind of hampered the book a bit. I don't know, I found myself kind of lost a few times, and the chaos didn't quite work the way that it did in the first one. It's also very interesting. Jade is very, very different in this one. It is 4 years later. She's undergone quite a character transformation. She's much more subdued. She's very much tried to leave behind her slasher-obsessed self from the past 4 years, which also adds a very interesting perspective to it, kind of her maturation and her struggling to figure out who she is now. While I said that I didn't like how we lost that unique sense of Jade's voice narrating the story, I did really like getting the perspectives of various other characters within Prufrock, just because it did make the town feel all the more real, and each of the characters' perspectives were very unique and interesting. Overall, I did enjoy this book. Again, I just didn't like it as much as the first one, and so in the end I gave this one 4 stars. And then after that I listened to the audiobook What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is a gothic horror retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I actually have never read The Fall of the House of Usher. I don't really know anything about it before going into this book, but I had a lot of fun with this retelling. I love a good creepy gothic mushroom fungus horror story, and this delivered exactly what I was wanting it to. It's very atmospheric. So in this book, we are following a main character who gets a letter from an old friend saying that they are very sick and dying, and so they end up going to their friend's house, the House of Usher, and while there, to kind of reunite with their friend in kind of their final days, they quickly realize that something is very, very wrong with both their friend's brother, and the house itself. Like I said, this is very much filled with creepy fungus mushroom horror. It's very atmospheric. The house is just eerie and dilapidated and moldering, and I had a lot of fun with this book. I loved our main character. Our main character is just very charming and witty. I was genuinely like kind of freaked out at one point. I happened to be listening to this often on my bus rides to and from work, and while I was walking back home from the bus stop one night, it was dark and there was a particularly creepy scene that found me kind of nervous and kind of looking over my shoulder a few times. I like I said, I listened to this on audiobook, and I give mad props to the narrator. I think that they did a fantastic job, and it added a layer to the novel that I just really enjoyed. Again, this is a very short novel. I think it's more of a novella, and there's just not really much more for me to talk about without spoiling much of this book, but overall I did really just have a good time with it, between our narrator and the atmosphere and just the overall kind of creeping dread of this book, and I think that if you were looking for a fun yet creepy gothic horror novel that deals a lot with mushrooms and fungus, I think you will really enjoy this, and I did end up giving it 4 stars. And then the final book that I read during the month of January was Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn. This is the sequel to Legend Born. And with this book, this series has solidified itself as One of my favorite YA series in the last like handful of years, and honestly I think one of my favorite YA series that I've ever read. So obviously I'm not going to talk about what this one is about because this is the second one, but in the first book, Legendborn, we're following our main character Bree. She's recently lost her mother in a very tragic car accident, and she's also just been accepted into a early college program, and so she's dealing a lot with grief and confusion and moving to this new college and this new experience. And while there, one of the first days that she's there, she witnesses something that she should not be able to see, and she quickly ends up finding herself pulled into this secret society called the Order of the Legendborn, where it is a magical society comprised of the descendants of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And when she finds herself kind of pulled in because she saw something she shouldn't be able to see, she also quickly realizes that her mother's death may not have been an accident, and she thinks that it has something to do with this order, and so she decides that she is going to kind of infiltrate and get to the very core of the order and figure out what happened with her mother. And that's how the first one starts. This book, lots happened in the first one. This one is much further down the line of the plot. And this one just was so easy to fall back into. Immediately within the first like 2 chapters, I found myself just absolutely sucked back into this world. Just rooting for Bree right off the get-go again. Bree is such an easy character to love and root for. She just effortlessly weaves herself into your heart, and you can't help but root for her no matter what decision she makes, even if it's something that you think is probably not the best decision. She's incredibly like fierce and brave, yet also very vulnerable at the same time. You see her at her highs and lows, and you cheer for her and you hurt for her all at the same time. And I honestly think that she deserves to be up in the like YA heroine Hall of Fame alongside like Katniss and all of the other infamous YA heroines. She is just so amazing. The magic in this world and the different societies and how everything is interwoven is so fascinating and fun. This book like had my heart racing at times, and that has not happened for a YA fantasy in a very long time for me. This also just effortlessly weaves in a lot of hard-hitting topics, and I think it just tackles them with such a subtleness, yet it packs a punch at the same time at just the perfect moments. I'm also just incredibly impressed with how Dion has sculpted this story. There are still so many layers that are continuously being peeled back, and we're finding new ways that things are woven together and linked together. I am not one that's ever been super interested in Arthurian legend or retellings or stories based around Arthurian legend, but this is just an amazing series. I honestly, yeah, it's one of my favorite YA series that I've ever read. This again is the second one. There's for sure a third one. I'm really not sure how many books are going to be in this series. On Goodreads there's only the first 2 listed, but with how this ended there's obviously going to be a third one. I don't know when it's going to be released, but I will be anxiously awaiting it for as long as I need to wait. But I think it goes without saying that I gave this 5 stars. So these are the 3 physical books alongside the 2 audiobooks that I read during the month of January. If you read any of these books or you're looking to read any of them, I'd love to know your thoughts on them. But thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing if you haven't already. But as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!